The thing I would start with is let's start with Brandon Beane and what he had to say yesterday because it's pressing. And the first I heard of Beane, what he was saying, I wasn't like tuned in right away to catch it live. My fantasy football group chat, ironically enough, popped off a little bit about some of the things he was saying about it's not fantasy football, which is a great way to get into fantasy football group chat to say, like, this guy says it's not fantasy football, which, of course, it's not fantasy football. But anyway, I went in and like, oh, yeah, that's right. He's talking. So I went in and listened to the whole thing, and I've listened to it a second time now. I wanted to go back and find very specific things, too, that he said because, we'll play them for you. But the thing I thought about Beane yesterday was that he carried the kind of tone that I won't speak for all of you. I was satisfied to a large degree. He said they wanted to do something, and he said that they moved money to do it and that they had other deals ready to move to create more space if they needed to, kind of painting a picture like if they had been able to do Trey Hendrickson. Let's just throw that name out there. He didn't, I am. If they'd offered a second to Cincinnati for Hendrickson and they were bent on staying with the first, the Bills would have needed to create some space. And this is back to Beane. He said they had papers ready, like boom, 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 hand these in. Here's your space. Now you can make your deal. So somewhere along the way, they were at least pursuing a player that required cap space that they didn't have. All right. One clue. He also said that there were some players they were pursuing, they're grinding on, he said, some of the guys are grinding on, will be UFAs at the end of the year, so they could pursue them at that point. Rashid Shaheed is one of those guys. There are UFAs at the end of the year, and all right, so I've got a clue there as well. Some of the guys, UFAs, that's Hendrickson too, by the way. Some of the guys, big cap hit, they were ready to do some stuff there. And maybe there were some cap hits out there that were so big they had to consider the year-to-year cap. Like, all right, that all makes sense. The thing that I appreciated from Beane was he and I also want to tell you a couple things. I think he might have accidentally given away some information. I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe I'm just reading between the lines a little bit too much. But the thing I thought he did yesterday was kind of validate anybody from Bills fans' feelings, mine, yours, that they should have done something. He thought they should have done something, and he tried to do something. And we could all sit here and say, I would have done more, I would have paid more. But, a GM in his spot could go to the podium and say, nah, we're good. He did end up saying we have a championship roster. I think we have a championship roster. And that's what I want to talk about with you. He did say, I think we do have a championship roster, but he's always trying to get better and wanted to go out and find additional help. And to me, that struck the right balance of where I am. I think they have a roster that could win the Super Bowl, in large part because of, their quarterback, their offense, and maybe some pieces on the defense that if they come together could look pretty good. But I think they could win the Super Bowl with the roster they have, and I also think that they should have tried to do more. And the GM effectively said that he thought they should do more, and they didn't. He said, I walked out of here as mad as any fan. And then I started to think about mad. The idea that you're mad, that's not the emotion you would feel if you failed to pull in, I don't know, a 7th rounder for Logan Wilson, right? That's what one of the Cowboys deals. The Cowboys also got Quinnen Williams. Mad is, I thought we should do something, and I think mad, if I'm just guessing, if I'm in that job that he's in, and I walk out of there mad, I'm mad at something, I'm mad at someone, I'm mad that another GM decided at the last second, nah, you know what? Like Beane says it's not fantasy football, and I think we all know that it's not with the cap, and you got to go to an owner and say, like, hey, I'm going to need $70 million. Is that okay? Well, you don't have to do that in fantasy football. But he said about some of these deals and the idea of it being fantasy football, he said he indicated that he was upset. And I'm thinking about my own fantasy football league. When am I upset? There's only two things I could be upset about if I don't get a deal done. One is that the guy I'm talking to, trying to hammer out a deal, we feel like we're in a good spot. At the last minute, that person backs out. You know what? We talked about it, and we're not going to move that player. That would make me mad if I was a GM. If I'm especially up against the deadline, and the deadline is also possibly a little bit of musical chairs, right? I want to find help at this position X. You make that position what you want. I need help at this position. And there are a couple over here that are being shopped, but I think I got a bigger fish on the line. I think I might get something here. And while you're trying to reel in that fish, let's just make it receiver for the sake of I know 4 guys whose names were mentioned. Let's say the Bills are really after Brian Thomas Jr., who was reportedly potentially shopped. And I've got reason to believe the Bills would have called on him. And they think, we might be able to get this done. We really might. And then there goes Shaheed, and there goes Jacoby Myers. And all right, well, now it's musical chairs, and I'm down to 1. I got 1 left, 1 chair left, and I'm pouring all my time into this idea and resources, and we're back and forth. And then they decide, you know what, we're not going to do it. That's something that if I'm a GM, just that scenario, I'd be mad. I worked hard on this. I wanted this. I thought we could get it done. We didn't. And that doesn't mean he wasn't willing to give up the price. That means that maybe that team pulled back that offer. It's maybe irony is the wrong word here, but I feel like it's fitting that anytime a GM says, this isn't fantasy football, I think the best way to imagine what it's like in all the potential scenarios is to envision your own dynasty fantasy football league. You've tried to make trades. No, you don't have to shell out, $80 million. But who among us hasn't attempted to hammer out a deal and think you're there, or even agreed in principle, and the person kind of pulls it back and like, you know what, after consideration, let me take this to my owner. Let me take this to my so-and-so. And you come back and say, we can't do it. And this happens in all walks of life. You get a deal, and hold on, let me make sure. Let me check with the manager. They come back and say, we can't do that deal. Well, I thought we had a deal. I thought we had something in place. So mad to me, mad as any fan. And I think whether he felt the temperature of how upset fans were by the missed opportunity or not, to say as mad as any fan, to me that's a little revealing about what happened. Mad. I don't think you get mad that you didn't add a depth corner for a 7th-round pick. I think you get mad that you had something that you thought was going to make a difference, and they didn't get it done. So that's the first part of it. The second part that I thought was interesting, there's a bunch here. Validating your concerns, validating that they wanted some pieces. He also talked about the injuries, right? Did Michael Hoyt's injury play a factor here? Maybe. They do have a lot of injuries. They have players that will come back, but he can only do so much, and when injuries are continuing to factor in, you're going to run up against that. That could be an issue. All right, I get that. The other thing, and I might have to go back and listen to this a third time, because from start to finish, at the start of the press conference, he's asked a few questions, and I don't think he gets asked about wide receiver, and I think he brings up wide receiver. Does that have to mean anything? Maybe not. You're listening to the person that is more keyed on that position than anything else professionally. So when he brought it up, I thought, we're talking about receiver. Okay. Later on, someone asked about receiver specifically, and he said, I know that's a hot-button issue. But prior to saying that's a hot-button issue, I believe, I'll go back and listen a third time in this break, he brought it up. There are lots of positions you could talk about. They could have been hunting Trey Hendrickson. They could have been hunting Quincy Williams. Maybe they called the Jets, and he revealed the Jets didn't really want to trade in the division, and maybe Miami didn't either. So I feel like I got some morsels along the way, little pieces, little this and that. And then I think about, let me give you one more thing here. Then I think about he made reference to watching some of the other trades and say, that's interesting. Right? And he talked about the new era of younger GMs. The average age for a GM is mid-40s. And when talking about the age of GMs, I went back and listened to this entire press conference because I almost thought that this clip might have been generated by AI and someone pretending that this happened. But he talked about how those guys have played fantasy football. The young GMs now, these guys playing Madden and playing fantasy football. And I thought, well, I know some of the younger GMs in the league. There's some really young ones, in fact. And one of them is in Jacksonville. Jacksonville's got a really young GM, right? That guy was he 34? How old? I'll double check right here. James Gladstone is his name. James Gladstone's a super young GM. So I got Beane bringing up wide receiver. I got Beane upset a deal didn't get done. And I'm trail of breadcrumbs in this thing. He brings up wide receiver. He's a little disappointed to upset a deal didn't get done. And he's referencing watching other deals and saying, interesting. And talking about young general managers in the league. And James Gladstone, the Jags GM, is 35. He's one of the youngest GMs, maybe the youngest GM ever hired to run a football team. Is he working with a GM that's 35, that's played fantasy football, that's played Madden, whatever you want to say? Like, I'm 46. I played plenty of fantasy football and plenty of Madden. But those three little clues to me, I think he was big game hunting. He's mad as any fan we didn't get something done. And they're grinding on guys for a while here. Grinding. Okay. This is trying to find an answer, trying to be better overall. I mean, I feel like they were after Brian Thomas Jr. I think that is that too far of a leap to pull those little breadcrumbs out of that press conference and say, I think he was going after a big fish. What's one thing that Brian Thomas Jr. would give them, even though it's not necessarily going great for him in Jacksonville this year, and the idea that he'd be available is kind of stunning. And I'd said throughout this process, I would be a little worried about it. Maybe a red flag, like why is a guy this good available so quickly? But Beane later on was talking about how they want to be the kind of team that can win any number of ways. And one way that we question whether or not they can win is vertically. And Brian Thomas Jr. would be an ex-receiver that they could play vertically. And I feel like I've got it all in front of me. I thought that might be a real scenario going in, and then it doesn't happen. And the press conference we heard yesterday, to me, was a GM that was upset. Something didn't happen because he was maybe going for something big. Now, maybe it's Hendrickson. I could be wrong. Like, you're mad. You thought, come on, what you're going to keep this guy? Why are you going to keep this guy? I've got the best offer on the table. Why would you keep him? He's a UFA. You're bad. Maybe he's trying to convince Cincinnati to trade Hendrickson, and that didn't work. But I liked his tone. I thought he struck the right chords. And, some of their problems that we talk about sometimes, whether it's nitpicking or whatever, the cap is the cap. The cap is his cap. So if they're up against the salary cap, no one's confused as to why they are. They've extended a lot of players, and maybe you and I talk sometimes about extensions they might regret or want back, or extensions that maybe aren't necessary, but whatever. Like, they've signed a lot of their own, and the reason they don't have space is because the deals that they signed. He didn't inherit this cap jail situation. He's been here long enough where every single piece of financial stuff on the books is his. Like, it's all his picks, his signings, and they're up against it because they're trying to put together a good team. So, 803-0550. If is that a conspiracy theory? Is it a little too far? Am I reading too far into it? You can let me know. Like, I three little tiny clues in a press conference that, to me, indicate I think they were after that guy. And it's to the point where I almost want to say, you know what? If this season doesn't go right, I want to leave it open to the idea that they'll trade for that guy in the offseason. Like, let's get back to that conversation we had in November and late October. And let's see, are you still interested in moving him? We're still interested in acquiring this player. Any deal you could have had at the deadline, the next year you might pick right up. Now, again, he's not one of the ones that you'd have to worry too much about the cap. Another reason I think it could have happened. He's not one you have to worry about an extension. He's maybe still available because if you are Jacksonville, I don't know, it doesn't work out with this guy. Fine, let's get to the offseason, trade. We can sign somebody else. We can kind of have a full offseason and go from there. But I'm going to keep that name on the top of my list. I'm going to keep that name, put a pin in Brian Thomas Jr. as someone that I wonder if the Bills were after that. I tend to think they were. That it just checks so many boxes. And the comment about the young GMs playing fantasy football. Maybe he's thinking about the Jets GM who, dumped a bunch of pieces. Maybe. But for me, Mickey Loomis is not a young GM. He's with the Saints. Mickey Loomis has been the GM for the Saints since 2002. Like, that's a long time, right? That's not a young GM you're talking about playing fantasy football. So Olave was out there. We talked a lot about these, but there's my reading between the lines. 803-0550. The question I guess I would have for you here is something that Beane said. His message was one of disappointment. They didn't get something done, something he shares with many fans. But he did say, even so, he believes they have a championship roster. Do you agree? Yes or no? Do you think the Bills have, as constructed, because the roster's the roster, do you think the Bills have a championship roster? Give us a ring. 803-0550. Just me today. Owen's here. Joe Kelly's here. Alt Joe. Yes, I woke up thinking about the thrilling three-way parlay we're going to hit at 9:30 because we're due. We'll do that today. There's a Thursday night game. There's a Sabres game against the Blues. The Blues got hammered last night by Washington, and Ovi scored his 900th goal against them in the process. So lots to get to, but if you want to jump on that, do you think it's a championship roster? They are 6-2. They could absolutely get the 1 seed. He thinks they could win the Super Bowl. I agree that they could. I don't think they have the best roster, but I think that they definitely could win it. It's a matter of whether or not, it all comes together. So let's hear from you.